Before the story of a people begins, there is a story of a garden and a choice. Light pressed back the deep, and the hand that shaped the heavens set the first footsteps upon the earth. In that place where rivers braided the soil and every tree gave good fruit, the world wore a quiet that seemed endless, and the breath of the Lord moved like a wind that would not be hurried. Yet even there, at the heart of beauty, a shadow gathered, a cunning, a question, a turning that would reveal how spiritual conflict gathers its strength in the smallest of moments. If this account stirs something within you, stay with it. Subscribe for more readings of these ancient lines, like what helps your heart, and turn on notifications so the story keeps finding you. Your support carries these words farther to those who hunger for hope. In the beginning, when the earth still bore the scent of first clay and the sky was new, God made man and woman to walk in the garden and keep it. He walked with them at the cool of the day. Their laughter and the quiet exchange of labor and rest were the sort of music a world born from word alone might produce. The trees stood as teachers, each leaf a lesson in faithful growth, and the fruit of the garden was a simple thanksgiving for works well done. Yet among the ordered things there was one absence, a knowledge earned by struggle, not granted without the testing of hearts. It was into that ordered world that a voice came, and the voice did not belong to song. The serpent moved with a subtle intelligence, its eyes reflecting the green and gold of the place, and its speech was a honeyed question. The tempter's craft was not blunt, it was a fine instrument that laid doubt as if it were a seed of curiosity. Did God say, it asked, soft as wind through leaves? The question reached Eve like an echo from some unvisited curiosity. It felt at once like an accusation and an invitation. Her thoughts, honest and unschooled in the ways of cunning, turned like a cup catching light. He promised knowledge disguised as freedom, offered sight where there had been trust. Where God had spoken boundary, the serpent whispered opportunity. Eve looked at the tree. Its fruit was described by God as forbidden, yet it held a brightness that painterly language could not render. Flesh, scent, the slight give under a finger. Curiosity is not sin in itself. It is the human hunger to see more than what has been given. But the serpent did not offer mere seeing. It promised to make them like the Lord, knowing good and evil as on equal footing with the Creator. The temptation nested inside a promise that appealed to desire, beauty, wisdom, autonomy. Adam stood beside her, their companionship a single garment of trust, and when the moment came, both hands reached and both tasted. The immediate consequence was as swift as dawn moved across the plain. Eyes that had been untroubled opened to a new anatomy of the world, shame, sudden and sharp, like a cold wind over a nakedness that had been unknown. They sowed fig leaves and hid among the trees. They heard the voice of the Lord, and their steps faltered. When God called, "Where are you?" the question was not ignorance, but invitation to confession. And yet the first answer was to shift the weight of guilt. Adam blamed the woman the serpent. In that exchange, the pattern of blame, evasion, wounded fellowship, and a broken relationship with God was set. See Genesis 3. Then came words that cut both judgment and a fragile mercy. The Lord pronounced consequence. The earth would be harder to till. Enmity would mark human toil. Sorrow would accompany bearing of children. And to the serpent he spoke a strange utterance that has echoed through ages. Of enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Of a bruise upon the heel and a rising that would crush the head. Genesis 3:15. In that lament and promise there is the first dark mystery. The conflict is not merely earthly but cosmic. The serpent's work will not be merely against individuals, but against a line, a promised seed who will stand in for humanity. Here begins spiritual warfare as a generational contest over the seed, the life that bears God's image and the life that rejects it. This first mystery is dark because it reveals opposition at the root. The tempter does not simply entice an isolated heart, he targets lineage, the continuity of blessing. Eve would carry within her both the capacity for life and the field of contest where deception could sow its seed. God's word, however, already pivots toward remedy. Even in judgment is a promise of undoing. That tension, judgment met by a blossoming hope, will thread the generations to come. Out beyond Eden, in the wide place where the ground drinks the footsteps of men, the story quickens and bends toward a second mystery. Adam and Eve's children multiplied. One tilled the soil, another tended flocks. The brothers brought offerings. The one whose work was of the ground carried the fruit of labor. The other heaped the best of his flock upon the altar. God looked with favor upon the offering born of a heart open to sacrifice. Jealousy, like a shadow, rose in the other and hardened into murder. Genesis 4:1-8. Cain struck Abel, and where the first wound had been upon creation, now blood stained the earth. The Lord set a mark upon the one who would have been slain, not merely as punishment, but oddly as protection, an inscrutable mercy that prevented further vengeance. Yet the pattern of enmity had deepened. Suspicion, anger, the spiraling of sin from choice to violence. Here the second dark mystery emerges. Spiritual warfare wears the cloak of the ordinary. It becomes a poison in household life, a war waged not only by voices in a garden, but by envy over harvest and altar. The serpent's influence spreads not merely by direct whisper, but by the contagion of the heart's turning. Pride, rejection, and the refusal to see one's neighbor as beloved provider of God's image become the battlefield where faith falters. That is why the narrative compresses, from Eden's hush to a field stained by blood, a small step that reveals how quickly spiritual corrosion moves from interior doubt to public tragedy. The narrative does not leave sin unchecked. God's justice moves in measured, heavy ways across the age. When wickedness multiplied and every inclination of the heart was bent toward ruin, the Lord judged the land with a flood. Yet before the waters rose, he appointed a way of preservation. He instructed a man named Noah to build an ark and to gather within it his family and representatives of living creatures. Genesis 6-9. The ark itself is an image, a refuge amidst judgment, worked out by labor and obedience. Rain fell as God had spoken. The earth was cleansed, and afterward a covenant sign was set, the bow and the clouds that would stand as a token of promise. Genesis 9:12-13. The flood is a stern whisper that creation will not be allowed forever to descend into chaos. Yet it is also a sign that God spares a line, a remnant through whom his purposes will continue. Thus, the warfare is not a two-faced battle of equal powers. It is an asymmetrical confrontation where the judge sustains a saving mercy amidst setting right. Generations flowed like a many-threaded river after the waters receded. Men and women multiplied, tongues that had once shared a single speech stirred into pride at Shinar, and the builders raised a tower whose top would reach to the sky, a monument to human felicity without God. Genesis 11. The Lord confounded their speech and scattered them across the face of the land. Again, the story shows how spiritual opposition is alloyed with human ambition. A desire to raise oneself up, to make a name apart from God, brings disorder. Yet even in dispersion, the divine plan marches. From the line of Shem, there would issue a people called to be a blessing. From that point, the narrative tightens its focus, like a hand cupping a seed. The Lord called Abram from his country, promising that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Genesis 12. Abram moved at a summons that required leaving the known for the faith of a promise. His name became Abraham, and with it came a covenant sealed in both verbal promise and right. Genesis 17. Here, the third dark mystery begins to lay itself open. Spiritual warfare over the covenant line becomes concentrated upon faith as the arena in which the promise advances. The enemy will aim not only at individuals, but at the faithfulness of the chosen household. Trials will come that press faith to its limit, and by those trials, the true nature of the promise is revealed.
Consider the test upon Abraham at the appointed hill when he was asked to offer the son of promise, Genesis 22. The request cut at the roots of hope itself, the child through whom the covenant would continue, the joy and laughter of a late season, the seed that had long been awaited. God bids it to be bound for sacrifice. Abraham hears and walks the path with steady obedience, his hands stained with the dust of a journey that had been prayer. At the moment the knife would fall, provision intervenes, and a ram takes the place of the boy. The scene is heavy with paradox. Judgment's gravity meets sacrificial substitution, and the covenant's integrity is preserved through trust rather than human ingenuity. The enemy's aim to sever the seed fails because faith yields a surrender that God will not allow to nullify the purpose he set, Genesis 22. These three mysteries, the seed contested from Eden, the ordinary forms of spiritual warfare that erupt in households and nations, and the focused assault upon the covenantal line that must be defended by faith, are not mere ideas but living currents in the unfolding saga. They color the lives of those who follow. Isaac, whose quiet life bears the weight of promise. Jacob, who wrestles with angels and men and whose name becomes Israel. Joseph, the betrayed son who rises in Egypt and whose providential suffering saves a people from famine. Joseph's dreams, his prison years, his rise before Pharaoh, these are not unrelated episodes, but a continued threading of the seed through hardship into deliverance. There, the tact of the enemy is to use human cruelty as an instrument. The hand of God turns it into salvation. Even the exile and later the cry upon the cross confess this paradox. Wrong seeks to consume the seed, and yet through the suffering of the seed comes life for many. Throughout the narrative, images repeat like a slow drumbeat. The garden that must be guarded, the seed that must be protected, the altar where blood marks both judgment and the pathway to reconciliation. Light and darkness are never merely opposites. They are moral landscapes where choices expose which kingdom shapes a life. The serpent, subtle and persuasive, works by misdirection, drawing attention to what might be gained and away from the covenantal command. Where God asks for trust, the tempter offers autonomy. Where God calls to wait, the foe urges haste. Spiritual warfare in this telling is less a parade of dramatic miracles and more the protracted war of influence. How a heart will orient, toward the voice that speaks with authority and kindness, or toward the whisper that promises independence. But there is a further shade to these mysteries: accusation and restoration. The adversary often acts like a prosecutor, pointing out failures, magnifying guilt, pressing for judgment. He delights in the unveiling of nakedness, in the exposure of fragile motives.
Yet God's word, even when it pronounces consequence, often includes symbols of cover and of covenant. After the fall, God made garments to clothe the couple. After Cain's crime, the Lord placed both punishment and protection upon him. After the flood, a bow of covenant spanned the heavens. In these acts, there's a theology of remedy that counters the strategy of accusation. When sin breaks story, God works to mend the line toward his promised seed. The narrator takes care to linger on small things: the smell of the sacrificial smoke, the roughness of bark beneath a child's palm, the heat of the sun that dries the earth after rain, the low murmur of voices around an altar. These details anchor vast theological movement in human skin. For where redemption is spoken of as a cosmic arc, it always touches hands and eyes and mouths that have known hunger and grief. And yet, as the tale presses forward toward the promised fulfillment, it keeps a watchful eye upon a single motif: the seed, which is both literal and symbolic. In every generation, the seed is present as potential and as point of conflict. It is the child of promise, the line through which blessing travels, and the target of the serpent's envy. It is in this motif that the final horizon appears: a seed who, though bruised, will bruise the head of the adversary, whose life and death and rising will answer the riddle that began at the tree. There are moments when the narrative itself pauses and speaks directly, brief and pastoral. See in these stories not only the fall of men, but the steadfastness of a God who does not abandon his design.
The Lord's methods may include judgment, but his purpose threads toward reconciliation and life. For the believer, the account is a call to remember that spiritual warfare is rarely spectacular. It is a daily tending of the heart, a vigilance against voices that promise sovereignty where only submission to the Creator can truly liberate. So the story moves onward, through famine and favor, through exile and elevation, bearing the theme of contest toward a day when all lines will be brought to account. The narrator keeps watch over the smaller episodes because they reveal the enemy's craft. Jealousy turned to murder, pride turned to a city that would be scattered, doubt turned to disobedience. And in each episode, God draws a line of rescue, an ark, a covenant bow, a sacrificial substitution. The battle is thick and ongoing, but the thread of promise is not broken. When the seed arrives in a manger and later walks among men, the long contest becomes visible in a different way. Through temptation faced and resisted, through accusations hurled by those who would darken truth, through the suffering that comes upon the faithful one who will bear sins not his own. The echoes of Genesis resound in the Gospels and beyond. The promise that began in whispered enmity at the garden is fulfilled in one who takes the blows, rises, and opens a way for life beyond the serpent's dominion, alluded to in references like John 1:14 and the hope of resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. This tale so far has sketched the first sweep of the conflict and cast light on three dark mysteries that move beneath the events: the contest of the seed from the outset, the ordinary domestic ways spiritual warfare spreads, the focused attacks upon the covenantal line requiring faith. Yet these mysteries are not closed puzzles, but living questions that press each reader. Where will you stand when the voice of the serpent appears in the guise of promise? Will you trace your lineage with trust or with the quickness to blame? The account pauses at the threshold of Abraham's household, where covenantal promise will be tried and reaffirmed, and where the drama of faith will press the enemy to his most bitter tactics. From here, the arc tightens toward the mount where sacrifice almost is demanded, and toward a line that will journey through suffering toward salvation. The storyteller keeps the gaze steady. In small choices, the larger warfare is often decided. Let us hold in memory the three shadows now named, and watch how they move forward. The seed contested in Eden, the warfare that becomes household and communal, and the targeted assaults upon those who bear the promise. Each will unfold along the roads that lead from tents to palaces, from altars to crosses, until the seed's victory, hidden in bruising and rising, can be seen for what it is, the reversal of the serpent's designs. The next moments press toward Abraham's faith and the test upon the mount, and from there toward the weaving of a people through favor and trial. Yet before those scenes come, the listener is left with a question that is itself a summons. How will you tend the soil of your heart so that the seed of God's life may take root and not be choked by the weeds of deception? The tale will continue, showing how God, in judgment and in mercy, moves to preserve a line for the sake of all nations. Abraham rose before dawn and packed his gaze with the promise. The tents lay dim behind him, the sleeping figures woven into shadows, and yet the road moved forward with a purpose that would not be argued with. He took with him 2 young men and the lad whom God had given, Isaac, a quiet witness to the wonder of a birth long prayed for. They went as pilgrims go, sand underfoot, the cool of morning on the skin, the slow, steady breathing of beasts and men measured against the vastness of the sky. The ascent to the appointed place was a small geography of the heart. Abraham walked with a father's tenderness and a servant's obedience braided together.
When Isaac asked, as children ask and fathers answer, where was the lamb for the burnt offering, Abraham felt in his throat the weight of a secret larger than his capacity to speak. God will provide, he said, and the words were both truth and trust, an answer that contained within it a summons to live as though the unseen hand were already at work. On the mount, the 3 men built an altar. Stones were stacked with the slow deliberation of sacramental labor, wood was arranged, the place smelled of sweat and dry brush and a fear that was sharper than the wind. Isaac carried the wood upon his own shoulders, symbol and sorrow,
while his father carried the trembling of one who had received a promise and must now surrender it. The narrative bristles in that moment, for the covenantal line, the seed of blessing, stood plainly exposed to the harsh test of obedience. When Abraham bound his son and laid him upon the altar, the scene became, for all who would hear the story later, the emblem of faith's paradox: obedience that appears to undo God's promise in order that it might be confirmed. The knife lifted. In a silence that echoed like an accusing witness, Abraham's hands stilled where hands are most private and profound. Then the angel stayed his hand and called out from heaven, commanding that no further act of slaughter be done. A ram, caught in a thicket by its horns, was found and offered in place of the boy. There is a mercy here that does not erase the cost. The voice that spared Isaac did not liquidate the memory of the act. The binding would remain, a wound in the memory that marks the tremendous cost of faith's obedience. But it also became the locus of God's provision, the place where the promise was not nullified but confirmed in the very hour in which its bearer was willing to place everything upon God's fidelity. "The Lord will provide," Abraham said again, and those words entered the long retelling as a covenantal refrain. The mountain gave back more than the immediate deliverance. In that hush, the covenant scope unfurled. "Because you have done this, I will surely bless you, and your seed shall possess the gates of their enemies, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." The promise and the testing braided into one another. Blessing came not as an unearned grant, but as the fruit of a trust that had been purified in fire. Yet the story does not allow a neat sanctification of heroism. The household continued to be a place of contest. The very presence of the child of promise had already set in motion jealousies and rivalries that would not be soothed by a single divine word. The other son, Ishmael, born earlier to Hagar by Abraham's own yielding to impatience and Sarah's anxious counsel, stood as a reminder that human attempts to hasten God's timetable would yield tangled outcomes. In time, Hagar and Ishmael would be sent away, an act that shows how jealousy and fear can cleave families and create new lines with their own burdens and promises. God did not abandon Ishmael. He watched over the cast out and promised to make of him a great nation. But his destiny would be distinct from the covenantal line which moved according to the original oath. This is the recurring pattern. God's sovereignty and human frailty intersect in households, and the serpent's craft often seeks to use impatience, rivalry, and fear as instruments to derail the promise. Yet God's fidelity threads through these disruptions. When envy led to revenge, God raised an ark. When cruelty sought to extinguish a life, God provided a servant who would carry the child to safety. When a father almost sacrificed his son, God intervened with a substitute and deepened the promise. The Mount's incident became a teaching for those who would later walk under fear's shadow. Faith sometimes demands that we relinquish what we love most into the hands of the Lord. Obedience can be the means by which God's larger purpose is affirmed rather than negated. The seed, whose bruising will overturn the adversary, is prefigured even here. The son spared, the substitute supplied. The pattern of substitution and provision will resonate through altars and ceremonies, through sacrificial language until the fullness of time. After the event on the Mount, Abraham returned to his encampments with a changed heart. The promise still echoed, yet now it bore the memory of the near loss and the ram's scent of smoke. Days followed with the ordinary needs of life: tending flocks, keeping watch, negotiating the fragile loyalties of extended kin. The promise multiplied in conversation and in silence. Visitors would come and speak of heirs, kings would pass through the tents and entail both danger and favor, and Sarah's laughter, first at the astonishment of a promised child, and later at her own fragility, would remain an emblem of the human paradox of delight mixed with disbelief. Time moved the line forward. Isaac grew, took a wife, and the covenantal thread passed on through marriages, betrayals, and reconciliations. Sibling rivalry would erupt afresh in the lives of Isaac's sons, reminding the reader that the struggle between the seed of blessing and the enticements of power is not easily contained. Jacob's cunning and Esau's sold birthright are not episodes apart from the original contest. They are continuations of the same motif, that the adversary seeks to invert God's purposes through human impulsiveness, and that mercy often arrives in ways unexpected and morally ambiguous. Through it all, God's method remained consistent. Preservation by selection, mercy extended beyond the immediate line, and a refining of the covenant by trials that hurt as they sanctify.
The seed was preserved, not by the perfection of its bearers, but by the mercy and faithfulness of the one who had spoken first to the tent of Abraham. The narrative takes pains to show that the chosen line is not an endorsement of human righteousness, but a stage upon which God's resolve to bless the nations is enacted. As the generations wound onward, from tents to wells, from caravan to palace, the pattern repeated. A favored son betrayed by brethren, exile that becomes the birthplace of providence, dreams that hold the future in their strange logic. In these domestic epics, the warfare is rarely the clash of armies, but the more intimate combat of words, favors, resentments, and decisions. A mother's counsel that seeks security at the expense of faith. A brother's impulsive sale that trades covenant for a bowl of lentils. A deception that secures a blessing through tears afterward. Each household story carries the mark of the primal contest beneath the fig tree. And yet, even as the plot thickened with cunning and exile, there were always those smaller acts of deliverance that betrayed the hand of God. A well unexpectedly found, a stranger's house that becomes a refuge, an official's dream interpreted for the saving of many. These are the subtler reversals by which the seed's path is sustained. The enemy's strategy, to seduce, to divide, to substitute a counterfeit promise, remains visible. God's strategy, to hide life within suffering, and to draw nations through a single line of faithfulness, becomes clearer by contrast. So the tale proceeds from Abraham's mount into the lives of his sons and grandsons, moving along roads that are both literal and moral. The chosen line advances amid errors and mercies, and the reader learns to recognize the forms the trial takes. At times, a direct test of obedience. At others, a domestic quarrel that masks cosmic significance. The lesson repeats itself like a drumbeat. Blessings are fragile, promises are contested, and the steward of the covenant must choose, day by day, between the voice that promises immediate control and the voice that bids surrender. Before the narrative widens further to kingdoms and exiles, to judges and kings, it pauses upon a particular strand, the life of Jacob, who would be renamed Israel, and the children whose destinies will knot nations together. Jacob's story will reveal how God can use a man's guile and a mother's strategy to fulfill a purpose that no human cleverness could claim as its own. In him, the motif of the seed in contention will be dressed in the language of birthrights and blessings, of ladders seen in dreams, of houses where quarrels become the antechamber of destiny. Thus, the path from mount to tent to foreign court tightens. The contest will move from the private altar to the public gate. It will meet the intrigues of courts and the cruelties of famine. It will send a favored son into a pit and later into the halls of rulers, where providence will wear the face of politics. Each step will reveal anew the strange economy by which the seed's line is preserved, often through what looks like failure, exile, and seeming abandonment. God orchestrates a greater preservation that makes room for nations to be gathered under blessing. In the silence that follows Abraham's return to his tents, one can almost hear the wheels of the long story begin to turn toward Egypt, toward a house of plenty that will choke the sons of promise with the temptations of power and will finally expel them into the wilderness of exile. But before countries and empires claim their roles, before kings rise and prophets speak, the narrative keeps its intimate focus: a father and son, an altar, a ram in the thicket. From this small scene, the larger drama will unspool, teaching every generation that faith asks for costly surrender, and that God's provision appears sometimes most brightly when all seems most barren. So the caravan moves on, and the tents are struck. The seed endures, bruised but held, and the story, like a carefully tended field, advances toward wider plots where its true harvest will be seen. The household passes through sorrow and mercy, and the Lord's hand, inscrutable yet faithful, continues to preserve a line through which blessing will be given to the nations. The contest is not over. It grows broader and deeper as the people multiply and as the adversary's tactics metamorphose to match each age. And now the narrative turns its gaze to Jacob, to the crossroads where destiny and deceit will meet, where a ladder will connect earth and heaven, and where the threads of promise will be woven into a people who will carry the seed forward, even as their own faith flickers. It is here, in this smaller and sharper story, that the household warfare will find new expression, and that the line preserved on a mount will be tested again in ways both intimate and national. The tents give way to journeys. The Father's voice yields to the struggles of a new generation. The covenantal promise presses insistently toward fulfillment. Jacob was born clutching his brother's heel. From the first breath, the house knew the shape of contest. Esau came forth ruddy and a man of the field, hairy and quick with the bow. Jacob followed, quieter, leaning toward the shelter of the tent. Their mother watched them with a gaze that read more than infancy. She perceived in their bodies the future unspooling, two nations already seeding themselves in a single womb. Isaac loved the game of the outdoors, where the sun hardened the skin and the spear answered need. Rebekah loved the hush of household counsel, the careful ordering of bread and blessing.
There, the first division took its place, a father's preference and a mother's alliance, as if destiny itself could be argued in the tone of affection. Years made the differences plain. Esau hunted. He returned with the red of the field on his hands and the quick promise of appetite. Jacob kept to the tents, to the woven things, and to the soft commerce of speech. Once, in a day of hunger, Esau came in wearied and famished from the open country. Jacob sat by the hearth and had lentils simmering. Esau said, "Feed me with that red bread, for I am faint." Jacob saw the want, and behind that want a question. What will you trade for the life at the hearth? In a moment that would be told again and again. Esau swore away his birthright for a pot of porridge. He rose and ate, and the act rested like a stain in the memory of the house. An easy giving, a preference of immediate appetite to future place. Time turned the household toward the final hour of blessing. Isaac grew old, and his sight failed. With failing sight came the weight of what he might yet say. He called Esau, grew the venison, and prepared to bless, to pass the father's words that hold a family's destiny. Rebekah heard this. Sorrow and calculation moved together in her. She called Jacob and set before him a plan not born of malice but of necessity. Necessity as she understood the covenant that had been promised to Abraham. The younger to carry, the elder to pass aside. She disguised him in the skins of kids so that the roughness of his hand might pass for Esau's. She clothed him in the elder's rough mantle and placed before him the venison in full. Isaac, his ears and heart leaning toward the bride whose hands had once bent over him, smelled the garments and felt the hairy hands, and in trust he pronounced the blessing that would not be undone by later hands. Esau returned, the scent of the field on him, and found the table emptied of his venison, and the house heavy with a blessing not his. His cry was the cry of one who sees a line slip through his fingers. The sons argued with words, and then with the iron of grievance. Esau swore to take a sword and to bring death to his brother if the natural order was denied him. Rebekah heard the oath, and grief-struck, bade Jacob flee to her brother's house beyond the Euphrates, to the place of her kin, where a bride might be sought, and where the tense shadow of Esau's wrath could not pursue. So Jacob left the familiar tents under cover of night and under the speed of a mother's counsel. The caravan of his departing steps carried with it that ancient paradox, human craft used to guard a divine promise. Wherever the hand of God would later be plainly visible, there first stood the bewildering figure of human will, making pacts with fear and hope. On the road, under a sky not yet stripped of dawn, Jacob lay his head upon a stone.
It was a stone ordinary in itself, but that night it became something else. In the hush, a ladder appeared in the architecture of his dream, a stairway of visions where angels climbed and descended, their passage crossing heaven and earth as if the world were a seam stitched by the very touch of God. Above it stood a presence that spoke the covenant again. The land upon which he slept would be his offspring's. His seed would spread like the dust of the earth, and through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. The voice repeated the promise made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, waking, named the place Bethel, house of God, and took the stone for a pillar, poured oil upon it, and vowed that if God would be with him and give him bread and raiment and bring him again to his father's house, then the Lord would be his God and the stone his house of worship. The dream contained both comfort and contract, a reassurance that the promise would not pass despite the cunning that had sent him on his way. Jacob's vow was not the language of unassailable faith, but of a man bargaining with heaven out of fear and need. Yet even that bargain sat beneath the promise. God's hand presses sovereignty through human bargaining, so that intention and divine will weave together in inscrutable ways. Jacob came to Haran, to the household of Laban, his mother's brother, and there his eyes met Rachel at the well. She came to water the flock, and her face moved him as quickly as any arrow. The wells of Haran were places of gathering, women who leaned upon pitchers, herds that shifted like a living pattern, and here Jacob's heart, previously heavy with flight, fell into the steady rhythm of desire. He told Laban of his kinship, and Laban received him, keeping him in his house, and Jacob served him for Rachel's hand. 7 years passed like days to Jacob, for love made the length small. He labored hard in Laban's flocks, tending them with the care of one who had been trained among the tents. But the household in Haran bore its own politics. Laban, shrewd in his dealings and wary of losing such a useful hand, was not a man of simple measure. On the night appointed, Laban took Leah, his elder daughter, and brought her to Jacob instead of Rachel. Only when dawn came and the veil was lifted did Jacob see that his embrace had been with the other sister. He rose in anger and reproach, yet Laban answered with the old custom. The elder must be married before the younger. Fulfill her week, and we will give you also this one for the service which you shall serve me still 7 years, Laban proposed. And Jacob, bound by his vow and by love that would not be shaken, but that would be tested, did so. Leah's eyes were soft and often unregarded. Rachel's was the heart Jacob had intended to win. From Leah came sons whom the household received: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, names that would one day mark tribes and songs, fortunes and prophecies. Rachel, for a long time barren, watched and wrestled in private with emptiness and envy. She gave Jacob her handmaid Bilhah that she might obtain children through her. Leah, in turn, gave Zilpah. The household's womb was shared among those who sought to press the promise into being by means available to them. In this woven intimacy, the birth of sons was as much political as it was tender. Each child a claim, each name a stake in the future of the line. Years piled like layers of cloth. Jacob's cunning, his tactic with the spotted and speckled during his tending of the flocks, his arrangement of rods at the watering troughs, mirrored the cleverness that had set him fleeing his brother. Yet there ran through these devices a double current: the human desire to craft outcomes, and beneath it, the strange hand of providence that seemed to prosper Jacob's flocks despite the scheming of Laban. Laban's household wealth grew, and the brothers-in-law watched one another with a suspicious eye. Deals were struck and broken, wages shifted, but in the midst of it, the promise continued to breathe life into a people being formed by mixture. Tribes born from love and jealousy, from covenant and from cunning.
Rachel finally bore Joseph, the son she had longed for, and upon his birth she said, "May the Lord add to me another son," a prayer doubled with hope and the memory of the covenant. Joseph's presence in the household was like a bright thread. Jacob loved him more than his other sons, and that love would later draw trouble like a magnet draws iron. The family grew denser, names stacking until Jacob had the seed he had been promised. And yet that proliferation brought with it fresh tensions, favoritism, sibling rivalry, the old song of contention repeated on a new register. In those years, Jacob learned the double lesson that had marked his life. God's promise moves forward even when human hands seize and scheme, and human hands, when earnest, can be used by the Lord to unfold his designs. Where Rebekah had contrived to secure the blessing, Rachel and Leah bore children through devices both tender and pragmatic. Where Laban sought advantage, the Lord's covenantal thread would not be cut. The household, with its laughter and its quarrels, began to look less like a private tent and more like an origin for nations, a small locus in which the breath of history would find its voice. As the years lengthened, Jacob's thoughts returned to the land of his fathers, to the promise, and to the face of Isaac growing old in Mamre. The sting of separation, the wound that had sent him forth, had not fully healed. With the multiplication of his sons, the urge to return strengthened. He weighed his time with Laban, the gain, the losses, the children born to his name. He had wealth then in flocks and in servants, but these were not the same as the hearth of his fathers, nor the altar stone at which men named God for their house.
A covenant summons tugged at him like an invisible compass. Word reached Jacob that Laban's sons murmured that their father might take back what had been prospered in his house. A fear quickened, and the hour to depart came into his speech like a necessity. He gathered his wives and his children, loaded the camels and the goods, and set out secretly from Paddan Aram, for he did not wish Laban to oppose his leaving, nor to exact his sting of quarrel. The road away from Haran wound beneath the sky. The tents they carried were filled with the talk of sons and with the preserved sense of a life built under another roof. Laban, when he learned, rose in hot pursuit with a train of men and camels. He overtook Jacob in the hill country of Gilead, and the two men stood face to face, the old camaraderie rounded now by accusation and fear. Yet even in that confrontation, the Lord moved to guard the line. Laban's heart was not unmoved by the covenant that bound them. He reproved Jacob for leaving in deception, and Jacob answered with accountings of the years served and the quiet providence that had prospered him. They set up a stone as a witness between them, and they ate there. A covenant was made. The pillar would be for a sign, and neither would pass the boundary to wage war. Thus they parted, Laban returning to his tents, Jacob going forward with his household. The contest, for the time being, had found a truce, but under the surface, the pattern of favor and struggle continued, for the seed's path is always threaded through opposition. As Jacob moved, his heart carried the memory of the ladder at Bethel, the promise that had sustained him when he was young and fleeing. He had vowed there to the God who had met him that one day he would make a house for the Lord. Now he journeyed under a sky that remembered the voice. His sons were a chorus of future tribes, and his steps were those of a man who had seen how the Lord's ways confound human wisdom. The line would continue, through Leah's weeping and Rachel's longing, through the cunning of fathers and the tenderness of mothers, through wells and wells again, where lives were altered in a moment. And so Jacob's caravan threaded the map of promise, carrying forward the seed that would, in time, form a nation. At night, around their fires, the sons slept with dreams of their own. Some saw themselves destined for simple fields, others carried within them the stir of more. But Joseph, newly birthed and favored, lay near his father's tent and drew questions from the other boys like a spark draws dry grass. Jacob watched him with that complicated love of a man who had once learned to lie his way into blessing. He wondered what part providence would give this son who seemed to hold a brightness the other brothers did not share. The family moved on beneath the stars, carrying the tension of what was promised and the habits by which men sought to possess it.
So Jacob's household edged toward the land of promise, not in a single triumphant march, but in the patient, often painful way of families, through bargains, through labors, through softened and hardened hearts. The line that began at the mount and thrummed through the tent now passed into a new generation. Its keepers were flawed, each in his measure, yet the seed's peculiar perseverance turned those flaws into part of the pattern. In Jacob, one could see the strange economy of God. Where human cunning tried to seize destiny, God used that very cunning to preserve the course of promise, bending it, sanctifying it, making it the stage on which nations would later be shaped. And so the road that led from the tents at Mamre to the great openness of Egypt had already begun to widen its shoulders. The children multiplied and argued, and the covenant's voice continued to speak through improbable means. Jacob, whose name would be changed when he met God in a different mood, carried on, guided by vows and by the invisible hand that had placed a ladder beneath his sleep. The household of Israel, already an embryo of tribes, went forward toward moments of greater trial and greater shaping, for the pattern of contention would not cease. It would only grow richer and stranger as the Lord's purpose drew near. They came at last to a well where shepherds gathered, and there Jacob saw Rachel again, for she came with her flock at evening. He asked who she was, and they answered, "The daughter of Laban, this Rachel." Jacob rolled the stone from the mouth of the well with hands made strong by years. He watered the flock and kissed her, and in that meeting the promise seemed to take on a human face, a new covenant of affection that would both bless and wound the days to come. They came at last to a well where shepherds gathered, and there Jacob saw Rachel again, for she came with her flock at evening. He asked who she was, and they answered, "The daughter of Laban, this Rachel." Jacob rolled the stone from the mouth of the well with hands made strong by years. He watered the flock and kissed her, and in that meeting the promise seemed to take on a human face, a new covenant of affection that would both bless and wound the days to come.